The courthouse lawn was quiet. Then it wasn't. The sound came before the shadow, a deep, rhythmic thudding that pressed against the chest before the mind could name it. People on the steps froze. Someone grabbed a child. A leather portfolio slipped from a lawyer's hand, and no one bent to pick it up. A black helicopter descended from a clear October sky and landed on the grass like it owned it. The door opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped out. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the courthouse. She walked across the lawn with the certainty of someone who had already decided how this morning was going to end. She stopped in front of one man, a man who had just lost everything. A man who 30 seconds ago had reached into his coat pocket for car keys he no longer owned. She looked at him. "I need you to save lives," she said, "and I need you to start today." Behind her on the courthouse steps, a lawyer in an expensive suit looked up from his phone. His face went very still. Not surprised, not curious, something else entirely. The divorce court doors opened at 10:04 in the morning. Elijah Cross walked out into the October air and stood on the steps and did not move. Not because he was devastated, not because he was angry, because he was taking inventory. The way a surgeon takes inventory before a procedure, calm, systematic, starting with what is present and working toward what is not the house, was gone. The savings account he had built dollar by dollar across 11 years of double shifts and missed dinners and the quiet loneliness of being married to someone who had already decided to leave but hadn't said so yet. Gone. The car gone. The community clinic on Farwell Avenue that he had opened 6 years ago with a folding table and a secondhand blood pressure cuff, and the stubborn conviction that someone had to serve the people the hospital system had quietly decided weren't worth the trouble. Gone. Emma folded into the settlement like a coupon, like something with no more value than the paper it was printed on. Renee stood on the landing 2 steps above him, with Carlton OC at her elbow. Carlton was in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elijah's first car. He was holding a leather portfolio and looking at his phone and doing an excellent job of pretending that none of this was personal. Renee was smiling. Not the smile of a woman relieved that something painful was finally over. Not even the smile of someone who had won a long fight and felt the complicated mix of triumph and grief that winning a long fight usually brings. Just winning, plain and unadorned. The smile of a person who had wanted something and gotten it. Elijah looked at her for 1 second. Then he looked away. He had one thing left. The judge had said so clearly in that flat judicial tone that treated the pieces of a human life the way an auctioneer treats furniture. Primary residential custody. Zara, 11 years old, already too smart for the world she was growing up in. Already watching adults with that quiet, measuring gaze that told you she was keeping a ledger somewhere. And one day she would present it. He held that fact in his chest like the last ember in a burned-down house. Then he reached into his coat pocket for his car keys and stopped. Right, no car. He stood there on the courthouse steps in Atlanta in October with his hand in an empty pocket, and the faint absurdity of the moment settled over him like weather. 41 years old, board-certified surgeon father, standing on a public sidewalk trying to figure out how to get to the apartment he'd been renting since March. With nothing but a messenger bag and the clothes on his back, he started walking. He made it approximately 30 feet. That was when the sound hit him, a deep, rhythmic thudding from somewhere above and behind, a low and insistent, getting louder fast. Several people on the courthouse steps looked up. A few stepped back. Someone grabbed a child's arm on reflex the way parents do when something unexpected and large moves through their airspace without warning. A helicopter, black, significant. The kind of aircraft that did not land on courthouse lawns by accident or coincidence or any reason other than someone had decided it would land there, and the world had rearranged itself to accommodate that decision. The hall was marked in silver lettering, clean and precise, Holt Air Medical. It settled onto the grass with the certainty of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. The door opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped out. Not Carlton's charcoal. Something different entirely. The kind of charcoal that comes from knowing exactly what you were doing and having dressed for it every day for several decades. She was in her mid-50s. She moved across the courthouse lawn with the economy of someone who had not wasted a step in a very long time. She walked directly toward Elijah, stopped 2 feet in front of him, looked at him. "Dr. Cross," her voice was even, not warm. Exactly. Not cold precise. The voice of a woman who had learned long ago that clarity was its own form of respect. My name is Vivian Hall. I need you to help me save lives, and I need you to start today. Elijah looked at the helicopter, looked at her, said nothing for 3 full seconds on the steps above them. He was aware, without looking directly, that Renee had stopped smiling, that Carlton Oy had looked up from his phone, that Carlton's face had gone very carefully neutral in the way faces go neutral when a person is managing information rather than receiving it. Processing, calculating running numbers on something he had not expected to need to run numbers on this morning. Elijah filed that away. You have the wrong man, he said. I have exactly the right man, Vivian Holt said. I'll explain on the flight. He almost laughed. He almost turned around and walked back to the sidewalk and kept going toward the bus stop 6 blocks east and figured out the rest from there. But Zara had asked him something that morning over cereal. In the careful voice of an 11-year-old who has learned that certain questions need to be asked quietly so the answer doesn't feel like it has to be loud. She had asked him whether things were going to be okay. He had said yes. He had no idea how to make that true. He picked up his messenger bag. He followed Vivian Holt across the courthouse lawn to a helicopter. He did not look back at the steps. Not at Renee, not at Carlton, not once. Elijah Cross had grown up on the south side of Atlanta in a neighborhood that the city's promotional materials had stopped mentioning sometime in the late 90s and hadn't found reason to revisit. His father drove long-haul freight. His mother taught third grade at an elementary school 2 blocks from their house and brought her students' drawings home and taped them to the refrigerator because she said a child's drawing on a refrigerator was the chest sign a house was still alive. He had been a serious child, not grim, not joyless, focused, the kind of child who finds something and holds on to it until he understands it completely before moving to the next thing. He found medicine at 14 in a high school biology class that covered the circulatory system in a way that made something click behind his eyes that had never clicked before. And just the idea that the body was a system, that systems had logic, that logic once understood could be applied, that applying it correctly could mean the difference between a person living and dying. He was not romantic about it, not drawn to the idea of being a healer in any mystical sense. He was drawn to the precision, the stakes, the way that medicine at its best was the most consequential application of careful thinking that a human being could perform. He got to Harrow Hospital on a full scholarship and 2 part-time jobs and the kind of relentless focus that leaves very little room for much else. He married Renee in his 3rd year of residency. She was finishing a business administration degree and had a laugh that rearranged rooms and an energy that he had found in those early years genuinely magnetic. Zara was born 2 years later. For a while, the life he had built felt like something real, something that was going to hold. Then came the night of March 14th. The patient's name was Walter Grimes, 47 years old, construction foreman brought into Harrow on a stretcher at 9:22 in the evening after a workplace accident had introduced a falling steel beam to his midsection in a way his body was not designed to accommodate severe internal bleeding, multiple organ involvement. The kind of case that got paged to Elijah because the residents on call that night had looked at each other and silently agreed this particular situation required someone who had been here before. Elijah had been here before. He scrubbed in at 9:47. The oar was already in motion around him, his team, his people. The scrub nurse, the Sewell agent nurse, the first-year resident there to watch and learn and try not to let her face show what her nervous system was doing. He looked at the vitals. He looked at the imaging. He made his assessment. He began for the first 90 minutes. The surgery went the way surgery goes when the surgeon knows what he is doing, and the team has worked together long enough to function like a single organism. Efficient, calibrated, not easy. Controlled. Then, at 11:47 in the evening, Walter Grimes's blood pressure dropped in a way that changed the calculation. Elijah looked at the numbers, looked at the tissue, looked at the blood panel that had come back 20 minutes earlier. He made a decision. He called for a specific anticoagulant. The decision was built on 3 converging data points and 9 years of surgical experience, and the kind of certainty that comes not from confidence, but from comprehension. He administered the medication, he continued. Walter Grimes died on the table at 12:51 in the morning. Not because of the medication Elijah had ordered, because the internal damage was extensive, and the body after a certain point runs out of ways to compensate. Because sometimes a person comes in hurt badly enough that the best surgical team in the state cannot change the outcome. Because medicine is not magic. Elijah called the time of death, removed his gloves, stood in the scrub room afterward and looked at the wall. He had lost patients before, not many, but some. Each time it left the same residue. Not guilt exactly, not failure, something harder to name. The weight of having been in the room when a life ended and being unable to say with certainty whether anything could have changed it. He went home at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was back at 7:30 when the chief of medicine called him in. The incident report had been filed. Elijah read it standing at the desk while the chief watched him with the expression of a man who had been in this room before and did not enjoy it. The report said Elijah had ordered the wrong anticoagulant protocol. It said he had proceeded against explicit warnings from the surgical team. It said his clinical judgment had been compromised in ways the report did not specify beyond that phrase. He read it again. Then he set it down very carefully. This is not what happened. He said the matter is under internal review. The chief said, I would like to see the original medication log, the time-stamped order records. The anesthesiologist documented notes. That's not how the review process works. I understand that. I would like to see the records. A pause. The matter is under internal review, the chief said again. 14 days later, Elijah was called back. A different document waited on the desk. A mutual separation agreement, a confidentiality clause covering the circumstances of his departure, and any related clinical events from the preceding 60 days. A deadline 48 hours to sign. If he declined, the hospital would pursue formal disciplinary action and refer the matter to the state medical board. He sat with that for a long time. He had a wife. He had a daughter who was 2 years old and had learned to say his name 6 weeks ago and said it approximately 40 times a day in the wondering tone of someone who could not quite believe this particular person belonged to her. He had no proof. He signed. He left Harrove on a Thursday afternoon with a box of personal items and the agreement in his pocket, and a question settling into him like weather settling into a season. Had he killed Walter Grimes? He did not believe he had. He knew what he had ordered. He knew why. He knew the logic of the decision and the data that supported it and the way the decision had felt in the moment. Not like uncertainty, but like clarity. He knew all of that, but the report said otherwise, and the report was the record. And he had signed an agreement that prevented him from disputing that record in any form, public or private. So the question had no answer, and it lived in him quietly for 9 years. He opened the clinic on Farwell Avenue 6 years after leaving Harrove. No surgical suite, no complex cases, basic care for the people the hospital system had decided weren't profitable enough to fully serve. Hypertension checks, wound care, diabetes management, prenatal guidance for women who couldn't afford the downtown clinics. It wasn't what he had trained for. Every morning he unlocked the clinic door and looked at the folding chairs in the waiting room and the secondhand equipment and the stack of intake forms that needed processing before noon. He knew that this was not the life the version of himself at 24 had imagined, but it was something. It was the only form of medicine he still trusted himself to practice. Then the marriage started to end. It had been ending for a while before either of them said so directly. Renee had wanted more than the clinic, more than the South Side apartment and the modest income, and the man who came home tired and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a silence she had at some point stopped trying to fill. He did not blame entirely. He blamed Carlton Ossie, but that came later. The divorce took 18 months, not bitter in the theatrical sense. Methodical, strategic. Carlton was very good at methodical and strategic. By the end, the clinic was gone. The savings were divided. The car was in Renee's name and stayed there. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a judge awarded Elijah Cross primary residential custody of his daughter, split the remaining assets, and closed the file, which was how he ended up on the courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket. The interior of the helicopter was not what he expected. He had expected corporate chrome and leather and the quiet performance of expensive things. What he found was functional to the point of austerity. Medical equipment mounted in precise configurations along the walls, a communications panel, a jump seat, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and something faintly mechanical that reminded him unexpectedly of OA prep rooms. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Vivian Holt sat across from him as the aircraft lifted. She did not wait for him to settle. Whole Air Medical operates 31 transport helicopters, she said. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi rural coverage, undeserved regions. Places where the nearest trauma center is 45 minutes by road, and the difference between someone living and dying is what happens in the first 12 minutes of transport. She looked at him, not at the window at him. In the past 2 years, we have lost 11 patients during transport. Not because of equipment failure, not because response times were slow, because the emergency protocols our medical staff use in the air were designed for hospital floors. And a hospital floor in the back of a moving helicopter are not the same environment. Elijah said nothing. In a hospital, she continued, you have space stability, relative quiet time, measured in minutes rather than seconds. In the air, you have 18 inches of lateral clearance, constant vibration that affects both the patient's physiology and the clinician's fine motor control rotor noise that makes verbal communication unreliable and pressure changes that alter the way medications behave in the bloodstream. She folded her hands in her lap, not nervously the way a person folds their hands when they are being precise. Our protocols don't account for any of that. We are executing correct procedures in the wrong sequence for the wrong environment. And because the procedures themselves are medically sound, no one has stopped to question the sequence. He looked out the window. The courthouse was gone. Atlanta was spread below them, organized and accidental at the same time. You know about Harrove, he said. Not a question. I know everything about Harrove. Vivian said, I know what the incident report on file says. I also know that the report does not match the medication order timestamps that a third party obtained through a data access request 18 months ago. She met his eyes.
Batuş's eyes.
I know you signed a confidentiality agreement that has prevented you from defending yourself in any forum. I know you have been running a community clinic on Farwell Avenue for 6 years, and I know you closed that clinic this morning because it was included in your divorce settlement. A pause. I did not come to that courthouse because you are a man with nothing to lose. I came because you are the most qualified person I could find, and because I believe the record on you is wrong. He was quiet for a long moment. What exactly are you asking me to do? He said, redesign our in-flight emergency protocols from the ground up. Work with my team. Observe, assess, rebuild. She did not look away, and if we find what I believe we will find in those old Harrow files, we deal with that too. He looked at his hands, the hands that had been accused of killing a man, the hands that had spent the last 6 years doing nothing more complex than suturing minor lacerations and checking blood pressure on Farwell Avenue. I'm not making any promises about what I'll find. He said, neither am I. Vivian said, that's why I need someone honest. The helicopter banked south and Elijah Cross, for the first time in 9 years, did not look away from where he was going. The Holt Air Medical Operations Center was 20 minutes outside the city. A low, wide building, practical, 3 helicopter pads flanking the east side, a training hangar large enough to fit a full medical simulation unit with room to spare. The kind of facility that looked from the outside like a place where people came to work rather than to be seen working. Elijah noticed it mattered. He showed up on his first morning in a collared shirt and dark pants with a legal pad and 2 pens. He had not owned a briefcase in years. He did not go out and buy one. Garrett Okafor met him at the entrance. Garrett was 44, broad-shouldered. He moved through space with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent years in environments where unnecessary movement was a liability. He had been a field medic with the Army for 8 years before going back for his medical degree. He had been running Halter's medical operations for 6. He had built the team himself, trained most of them himself, and the handshake he offered Elijah at the entrance had the quality of a test rather than a greeting. I want to be straight with you, Garrett said. They were walking the corridor toward the operations floor. He said it without preamble, the way he apparently said most things. I think Miss Halt made this decision for reasons that have more to do with your story than your qualifications. A surgeon who surrendered his license consulting on emergency protocols. I didn't surrender my license, Elijah said. I signed a separation agreement under duress and without access to my own records. The license itself was never formally revoked. Garrett looked at him. Those are not the same outcome, Elijah said. Garrett held that for a moment. Then he pushed open the door to the operations floor and didn't respond, which told Elijah 2 things. First, Garrett was sharp enough to recognize the distinction even if he wasn't ready to accept it yet. Second, he was a man who let results settle arguments rather than words. That was a man Elijah could work with. He spent the first week saying almost nothing. He sat in on simulation drills. He watched the team run mock trauma scenarios inside the helicopter training unit, a full-scale aircraft mock-up mounted on a hydraulic platform that could simulate flight movement turbulence and pressure variation. He observed the way the paramedics moved inside the simulated cabin, the way the physicians made decisions, the sequence in which they reached for equipment, the small hesitations that accumulated under the combined pressure of simulated movement and simulated urgency. He filled his legal pad with notes and kept them to himself. What he found by the end of that first week was not a failure of skill. Every person on Garrett's team was competent. Several were exceptional. The paramedic named Lisa, who could start a line with one hand while bracing against turbulence with her elbow. The flight physician named Dwight, who made triage calls with the calm of someone who had learned to separate urgency from panic. Good people train people. Amount, the problem was structural, and it was the same problem buried in every incident report dressed in different details. The protocols they were using had been written for a hospital floor. On a hospital floor, you have space, a stable surface, colleagues within shouting distance, and equipment organized by category and time measured in minutes. And in the back of a moving helicopter, you have approximately 18 inches of usable clearance on either side of the patient litter. You have constant vibration that degrades fine motor precision in ways that compound over time. You have rot noise at a frequency that makes normal speech nearly inaudible, which means verbal confirmation of medication orders, a cornerstone of safe hospital protocol, becomes an unreliable mechanism. You have altitude and pressure changes that alter absorption rates for several common emergency medications. And you have a ceiling on the number of hands available and the number of moves any one person can make before reaching for the next piece of equipment. In that environment, the sequence of intervention mattered as much as the intervention itself. And in the sequence the team was using had been borrowed wholesale from a context that shared almost none of the physical constraints of where they were actually working. They were executing correct medicine in the wrong order for the wrong room, and no one had questioned the order. Because the medicine was correct, and when the medicine is correct, it is very easy to assume the problem must lie somewhere else. Elijah brought his findings to Garrett on a Friday afternoon. He laid the legal pad on the table and walked through what he had found methodically. Without editorializing, he proposed a revised framework, risk classification, and patient triage. In the first 90 seconds of flight before any intervention was initiated, hemorrhage control prioritized above airway management in specific trauma categories where blood pressure drop was the primary threat, and a complete reorganization of the emergency supply bag according to one principle. Sequential single-hand access rather than categorical storage. Right now, the bags were organized the way hospital crash carts are organized by category, in the back of a moving helicopter. That meant a clinician might need to reach past 6 items to get to the 7th using both hands while the aircraft moved beneath them. The new design meant the first thing you needed was at the top, the second thing directly beneath it, and so on, and silo-logical, the kind of insight that seems obvious in retrospect and stays invisible until someone sits with the problem long enough to actually see it. Garrett looked at the proposal for a long time without speaking. "Run it in simulation," he said. Finally. Monday morning, the simulation ran for 4 hours. By the end of it, the average time to stabilization for a severe hemorrhage patient had dropped from 19 minutes to 11. The team had not changed. The equipment had not changed. The training had not changed. Only the sequence. Garrett stood at the edge of the simulation bay and watched the final run all the way through without expression. When it was over, he stood there a moment longer. Then he walked to where Elijah was standing. "I still don't know what happened at Harrow," he said. "Neither do I," Elijah said. "Not all of it." Garrett nodded once. He did not apologize for what he had said at the entrance on the first morning. Elijah had not expected him to, but something had shifted between them. Not warmth exactly, not friendship. The respect that forms between two people who have measured each other honestly and found the measurement fair. That was enough. Renee called on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the simulation results had circulated internally. Elijah was in the kitchen of the apartment he'd been renting since March, helping Zara with a worksheet on American geography state capitals, which apparently required more emotional investment than he had anticipated, because Zara kept sighing at the map the way people sigh at things they find personally disappointing. His phone buzzed on the counter.
만나노심.
Renee, he looked at it for 1 second. Then he stepped into the hallway and answered. I've been thinking about Zara, Renee said. Her voice was measured. Careful. The voice she used when she wanted something but had decided the wanting should not be visible. About the current arrangement, whether it's really working for her. I mean, the arrangement is working fine. Elijah said she's doing well in school. She's adjusted. She's with you full time. Elijah, that's a significant amount of pressure on a single parent, especially with everything going on right now with your new Renee. A beat. Say what you mean, he said. Silence. The silence of a person recalculating. I just think we should revisit things, she said finally. Given the changes in your situation, my situation hasn't changed enough to give you what you're looking for. And I think you know that he kept his voice level, not cold level. There was a version of this conversation that could turn sharp, and he was not interested in that version. You left, he said. That's done. But if you want to be part of Zara's life, her actual life, not a custody structure that works for you, that conversation starts with honesty, not strategy. Renee's voice cooled. I could discuss this with Carlton. That's your choice, Elijah said. But before you do, ask yourself whether Carlton O.C. has ever given you advice that wasn't also useful for Carlton. He ended the call, stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked back to the kitchen and sat down next to Zara and looked at the worksheet. Montana, he said. Helena. Zara wrote it down. Did not look up. Who was that? Your mom. Is she okay? She's fine, he said. Keep going. Zara studied the map. Pierre, that's South Dakota. That's South Dakota, he agreed. She moved her pencil then, without looking up. Bar. Yeah. Are we going to be okay? He looked at the side of her face. 11 years old. Asking the questions adults avoid because the answers are complicated. Yes, he said. She kept writing. He sat in the kitchen of his rented apartment and made a private promise to himself to figure out how to make that true. That night after Zara was asleep, he lay in the dark and thought about the medication log, the one he had been denied 9 years ago. The one that would have shown in timestamp detail exactly what he had ordered and when and in what sequence. The record that would have told a different story than the incident report. He thought about what Vivian Halt had said on the helicopter. The report does not match the medication order timestamps that a third party obtained, a third-party tie-ins. That meant the original digital records still existed somewhere or had been recoverable, which meant the incident report and the actual data were not the same document, which meant he sat up in the dark. Dim. He had spent 9 years asking himself whether he had made the mistake the report described, whether his judgment had been compromised the way the language suggested. He had treated the question as closed. What if the question had never been closed? What if it had been waiting all this time for someone to go back and look at what the records actually said? He thought about Zara asking if things were going to be okay. He had been thinking about the financial architecture of a single-parent life, the job at Holter, the apartment, the school district. He had not been thinking about the other thing, the question underneath everything else, the one he had carried for 9 years in a box he had labeled unanswerable and sat on a high shelf and tried with varying success to stop looking at. He got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee he did not drink, and for the first time since he had walked out of Hardgrove Hospital with a box of personal items and a question with no answer. Elijah Cross stopped asking what he might have done wrong. He started asking who had told him that he had. The file was from 8 months ago. Elijah almost missed it. He had been sitting in the records room at the back of the operations center for 3 hours that Tuesday afternoon, cross-referencing incident reports with medication logs, the way he used to cross-reference lab results with clinical presentations back at Harrove, looking for patterns, looking for the shape of the problem underneath the individual cases. And most of what he found was ordinary documentation delays, transcription errors, the normal noise of a high-pressure environment where people are trying to save lives and paperwork is the thing that happens after. Then he pulled case number 7-114. Patient 52 years old, farming accident, severe blood loss, transported by Halter from a rural county 60 miles south of Atlanta, died en route. The incident report listed cause of death as delayed clotting response following standard hemorrhage intervention. Standard, he looked at the medication log. Then he looked at it again. A critical clotting agent, the one that should have been administered within the first 4 minutes of a hemorrhage of this severity, was logged as not administered. Equipment unavailable at point of critical need. He set that page down. He picked up the secondary documentation. In the back of the file, tucked behind 3 pages of transport data and a copy of the patient intake form, was a handwritten field note, the paramedic's own record. The kind of documentation that gets written on a knee in the back of a moving aircraft and stuffed into a folder because there is no better option in that moment. The handwriting was compressed and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone writing fast in a space that was moving beneath them. It said clotting agent drawn and readied at T+3, administered per protocol, patient response inconsistent with expected mechanism. He read it twice. Administered per protocol. The typed log said not administered. The handwritten note said administered per protocol. Same patient, same flight, same medication. 2 records, 2 different realities. Elijah sat with that for a long time. And the thing that made the blood move differently through him than it had moved in years. He had seen this before, not in someone else's file, not in a case study, not in a training manual describing common documentation errors in emergency medicine, in his own 9 years ago. A typed record that said one thing, his own knowledge of what had actually happened, saying something else entirely. The record winning his knowledge, losing him signing an agreement that prevented him from ever saying otherwise. He set the file down on the table, looked at the wall across from him. Something that had been sitting in a locked box on a high shelf in the back of his mind for 9 years shifted. Quietly, the way ice moves when the temperature changes, not dramatic, not sudden, but irreversible. He picked up the file, walked to the elevator, rode it to the 4th floor, where Vivian Holt's office occupied the corner with windows facing the helicopter pads. He knocked once and opened the door. She looked up. He set his phone on her desk. The scanned field note beside the typed medication log, both visible on the screen. She read at both pages, the typed log and the handwritten note. She read the way she read everything completely, without the performance of urgency, which was its own kind of urgency. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then she looked up at him. "I want the raw system logs from Harrow," he said. "Not the incident report, not the summary document. The original digital records, timestamps, user access history. Every entry made to Walter Grimes's file, from the moment he was admitted to the moment I walked out of that building." She held his gaze. "You think the file was altered? I think the file I was shown 9 years ago does not reflect what actually happened in that operating room." He did not look away. "And I think the pattern I just found in your case files looks exactly like the pattern that ended my career." Vivian looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her phone. She made 3 calls that evening. Elijah didn't hear them. He was in the parking lot, sitting in the car I had borrowed from Garrett. A detail that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Borrowing his skeptic's car to drive home to the apartment where he was slowly unraveling the thing that had destroyed him. And he was looking at the Atlanta skyline, going orange and gray at the edges, and thinking about Walter Grimes, 47 years old construction foreman, a man who had come into Harrow on a stretcher on a March night and had not walked out. And somewhere in the data trail of that night, there was either evidence that Elijah had failed him, or evidence that someone else had decided to say that he had. He did not know yet which one it was, but he was going to find out. The forensic data recovery firm Vivian retained had a one-word name and an office in a building that did not advertise what happened inside it. She had worked with them on a previous matter she did not specify. She trusted them the way people trust tools that have not failed them, completely and without sentiment. 4 days later, the restored Harrow system logs were on Elijah's desk. He waited until after 7 in the evening, until the operations center had gone quiet around him, until Garrett had left and the administrative staff had filtered out, and the only sounds were the HVAC system and the distant rotation of helicopter rotors on the pads outside being run through their nightly check. Then he sat down and opened the file. He read slowly. He was not looking for confirmation of what he already believed. That was not how he had been trained to read data. You read data without a conclusion waiting at the end. You read it the way you read a patient openly, without deciding what you were going to find before you found it. The medication order for the anticoagulant he had called for during Walter Grimes's surgery appeared in the original order log at 11:47 in the evening. His name, his access credentials, The exact medication, the exact dosage time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. He had ordered it. It was there in the original record exactly as he had always known it to be. He kept reading at 3:14 in the morning, 2 hours and 23 minutes after Walter Grimes had been pronounced dead. 2 hours and 23 minutes after Elijah had removed his gloves and stood in the scrub room and looked at the wall. 2 hours and 23 minutes after the case was closed and the room had been cleared, and Elijah had driven home through empty streets and walked into a house where his wife was asleep and his daughter was asleep, and no one knew yet that by morning everything would be different. The same entry had been modified. Order status changed from administered to not indicated. He looked at the modification record. The change had been made from an administrative account, not a physician's account, not a nurse's workstation, not any clinical terminal in any part of the hospital that had legitimate access to a patient's medication orders at any hour. An administrative account registered to Harrov's Operations Management Division, back office scheduling facilities, coordination. The kind of account that handled room assignments and vendor contracts and had no reason, no legitimate, conceivable, defensible reason to touch a surgical medication record, ever let alone at 3:14 in the morning, let alone on a chart belonging to a man who had been dead for 2 hours. Elijah set the file down on the desk. He did not move for a long time. Outside, a helicopter lifted off from pad 2. The sound built and then receded into the dark. And in the silence after it, he sat with what he was looking at. 9 years. 9 years of waking at 4 in the morning with a question pressing on him from inside. 9 years of the clinic on Farwell Avenue, and the careful work that was the only work he still believed he was safe to do. 9 years of a marriage slowly losing pressure, like a tire with a slow leak not blowing out, just getting flatter. Until one morning you notice the ride has changed, and it has been changing for longer than you realized. 9 years of Zara growing up with a father who showed up and coached her soccer team and helped her with homework and carried underneath all of it. A weight she was too young to see, and he was too proud to name. He had not made a mistake. Not on the night of March 14th, not in the operating room, not in the decision that the report had described as compromised judgment. He had made the right call in a room where the call mattered and the patient had died anyway. Because sometimes patients die anyway. And the body reaches a point where no intervention changes what is coming. Someone had sat at a computer at 3:14 in the morning and reached into a dead man's chart and changed the record to say otherwise. Someone had done that deliberately with a specific account at a specific time. While Elijah was at home asleep, not yet knowing that by the time he woke up, the story of what had happened in that OR would already have been rewritten without him. He was not returning to Harrov to vindicate himself in any formal sense. He was not interested in a ceremony or a statement or the institutional architecture of being declared correct. He was interested in who had done this and why, and whether the thread he had found in case 7-114 at Hold Air connected to the same hand that had reached into his own records 9 years ago. He thought it did. He could not yet prove it. But in surgery, when you see the same presentation twice, you do not assume coincidence. You start looking for the underlying condition. He found the heostatic agent problem on a Wednesday routine. That was the thing about it. He had not been looking for it specifically. He had been doing what he had been hired to do, reviewing supply chain documentation as part of the broader protocol assessment, checking that the equipment specified in the new procedures was the equipment actually loaded into the flight kits. Most of it checked out. Then he got to the hemostatic agents. The current supply, a batch integrated into the flight kits 6 weeks earlier, had come through a procurement channel he did not recognize. Not the standard vendor Holt Air had used for the previous 3 years, a new supplier listed on the purchase order as Vert.
Mush.
Ex-clinical partners he had not heard of Vertex Clinical Partners. That was not by itself alarming. Supply chain shifted, vendors changed, procurement happened through channels he was not always privy to. But he pulled the certification data, and then he pulled the stability studies. And then he sat at his desk for 45 minutes reading through the stability studies very carefully. Well, the compound's clotting performance was sound under standard laboratory conditions. Room temperature, stable surface, the conditions under which the certification testing had been conducted. All of it exactly as advertised. But the stability data also included a footnote buried small. The kind of notation that gets skipped on a first pass and a second pass, and possibly a third about performance degradation under combined stresses. Sustained mechanical vibration above a specific frequency threshold. Ambient temperature variation exceeding a certain range across the duration of exposure. He looked at the frequency threshold. Then he looked at the vibration profile of a Halt Air helicopter at cruising altitude, which was in the operational data he had been reviewing for weeks. Then he looked at the temperature variation data from Halt Air's own flight logs, which showed an average ambient range in the patient compartment during extended transport of 21 degrees across the duration of a standard flight. He put those three things together. In a hospital, this drug worked in a controlled environment with stable conditions and predictable temperature. Yes, it did exactly what the certification said it did. In the back of a helicopter flying 200 meters over open terrain in variable weather. The compound degraded not catastrophically, not in a way that would be obvious on the ground, or in a short transport, or in conditions that stayed within the testing parameters, but in the long hauls in the flights to the rural counties where the distance was the entire point. In exactly the situations Halt Air was built to handle, it became unreliable. And unreliable in a hemorrhage scenario was the same as wrong. He wrote up the full analysis that afternoon. No editorializing, no language designed to alarm, just the data, the comparison, and the conclusion the data produced. He took it to Vivian's office and set it on her desk and walked her through it. She read it twice. "Pull it," she said. "Today," he said. Today, she agreed. He went back to his office, and for about 4 hours, he believed the problem was solved. The board meeting was the next afternoon. Elijah had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the decision had already been made before anyone sat down, and the conversations existed to give the decision the appearance of having been reached together. He knew the architecture of those rooms, the way certain people positioned their chairs, the way language tilted toward outcomes rather than processes. This was one of those rooms. 7 board members, 3 of them had been briefed before the meeting on the demonstration timeline and the contract value attached to it. A federal service agreement, 7 years expanded coverage across 4 additional states. The dollar figure attached to it was the kind of number that changes a company's trajectory. The kind of number that once it enters a conversation starts doing its own talking. The demonstration was 11 days away. Pulling and replacing the hemostatic supply at this stage, 2 of the 3 brief members explained would require resubmitting portions of the equipment certification package to the federal oversight body, which could mean delays of several weeks, which could invalidate the current approval window entirely, which could mean the contract went to someone else. Warren Briggs said it plainly. Briggs was the kind of man who valued directness the way some people value furniture functionally, and only up to the point where it became inconvenient. "The agent is certified," Briggs said. "The risk assessment has been conducted. I see no basis for pulling a certified product 11 days before a federal demonstration on the strength of an internal analysis prepared by a consultant with a contested professional history." Elijah looked at him across the table. The certification was conducted in a ground laboratory under standard conditions. Elijah said, "I'm telling you what happens to this compound in actual flight. That is not opinion. The stability data is in the report. The certification body reviewed the stability data." Briggs said they approved the product. The certification body did not test it at the vibration frequency and temperature variation of a 200-mile rural transport. That combination was not in the testing parameters. Briggs looked at him steadily. "You are a consultant with a contested professional history." Just that sentence placed on the table like a card being played. Elijah looked at the card, recognized what it was, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would move Warren Briggs. And Elijah Cross had not spent 9 years in the wreckage of a record used against him to come here, and let a different record be used against him in a different room. He was not going to lose his composure. He was not going to perform. He was going to remember this moment very carefully. Vivian overruled the board on the pull. That part she had authority to do, but the replacement supply could not be sourced and certified inside 11 days. Doera could move that fast through the federal certification process. It was not a failure of will. It was physics. The compromise was the worst version of a compromise because it was not really a compromise at all. It was a postponement dressed in the language of resolution. Keep the flag product in the kits for the demonstration. Flag it for post-demonstration replacement. Proceed as planned. Elijah said no. He did not have a vote. He said no anyway. He walked out of that meeting and stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and breathed. Not to calm himself, to measure himself, to verify that he was still the person he had been in that room, and not the version of himself who had signed things in offices because he had nowhere else to go. He was still that person, but he was also standing 11 days away from watching something preventable happen, because the people with authority to prevent it had decided not to. He could not stop it, not yet. The demonstration was on a Thursday, clear sky. October doing what October sometimes does in Georgia, which is behaved like summer agreed to let someone else try for a while. The training facility had been arranged the way federal demonstrations are arranged, with the self-consciousness of an institution that knows it is being evaluated and has organized everything to communicate that it knows how to be evaluated. Observers in a glass enclosure overlooking the field. Representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services. 2 regional emergency management directors, the full Holt Airborne, a pool of credentialed press. Elijah stood at the field perimeter with Garrett. They had not talked much about what was in the flight kits. Elijah had told Garrett what he had found and what the board had decided. Garrett had looked at him for a moment, then looked at the helicopter pads and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The simulation began. Multi-patient mass casualty event, various injury profiles, triage loading, in-flight treatment, while the ground team managed the scene. The design of the scenario was built to stress test both the protocol and the team at the same time. For the first 40 minutes, it was the clearest argument Elijah could have made for his own work. The revised protocol ran cleanly. The team moved through triage at a pace that drew audible reactions from the observation enclosure above. And a pediatric trauma scenario, historically the weakest point in the old protocol, where the sequence tended to break down under the added pressure of a smaller patient, and different physiological parameters, was handled in under 8 minutes, from the moment the helicopter touched down to the moment the simulated patient was stabilized. Garrett said nothing beside him, he didn't need to. Then the hemorrhage scenario began. Simulated patient, severe abdominal trauma, active blood loss. The flight medic reached into the kit and initiated the hemostatic intervention according to protocol. The sequence was correct. The dosage was correct. The timing was correct. Assignment. Every decision the medic made was the right decision based on the best available information. 980 seconds in the biological test model, a standardized tissue analog used for high fidelity. Training simulations began showing signs of abnormal coagulation, response clotting occurring in the wrong tissue zone, diffused rather than targeted, not what the compound's mechanism was designed to produce. Exactly the pattern Elijah had predicted based on the stability data, based on the vibration profile, based on the temperature logs, based on 45 minutes of reading a footnote that 3 consultants before him had apparently not read to the end. The lead physician on the scenario looked at the readings, looked at the tissue model, called a halt. The field went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause, the quiet of a thing going wrong in front of people who were paid to assess whether things went wrong. Elijah stood at the perimeter. He had told them. He had shown them the data and written the analysis and presented it in the board meeting and said this would happen and been told he was a consultant with a contested professional history and the certification body had already reviewed everything and the demonstration was 11 days away and the contract was worth what it was worth. He stood there and felt the stillness of a man watching something preventable occur because the people with the power to prevent it had decided the prevention was too expensive. It was not the first time he had felt this. It might not be the last, but he was still standing and he was not signing anything. By 6 o'clock that evening, 2 regional health industry publications had run the story. He read it on his phone in the parking lot sitting in Garrett's borrowed car again, because that had apparently become the location where significant things happened to him. Now the story named him, of course it did, Elijah Cross, former surgical attending at Harrove Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Patient death license surrender, and now the consultant behind the flawed protocol that had failed in front of federal observers at Holt Air Medical's demonstration for a major government contract. Discredited, the story called him. Not alleged, not reportedly discredited. He read it twice. Then he focused on the logistics. The demonstration had ended at 12:06 in the afternoon. The story had published at 6:02 in the evening, 6 hours, which was fast, specifically fast, given that the information in the story was not available from the observer enclosure. Equipment names the exact nature of the coagulation failure. internal timeline data that had not been released through any official channel. The kind of detail, if you were inside that building, working the case with access to the operations data in real time. And whoever had given the reporter what they needed to write this story had been inside that building and had transmitted the information within hours of the demonstration ending. That was not a journalist doing good work. That was a pipeline. Someone had set it up in advance, had been waiting for the failure, had been ready to move the moment it happened, which meant they had known the failure was coming, which meant they had known what was in those kits. Elijah sat in the car and looked at the Atlanta skyline going dark at the edges and thought about Carlton O.C. standing on the courthouse steps 2 feet from Renee. That morning, weeks ago now, but feeling like a different era entirely, when Vivian Holt's helicopter had descended onto the courthouse lawn and Carlton had done the thing that Elijah had registered and filed and not yet fully understood. He had gone neutral, not surprised, not curious, not any of the things a person's face does when something unexpected descends from the sky onto a public lawn. Neutral. The deliberate flatness of a man who was managing information he already possessed, who had run the calculation before arriving at the courthouse and was watching the first variable confirm itself right on schedule. Elijah had seen that expression in that moment and filed it under notable without knowing exactly why. He knew why now. He drove home, radio off. Zara was at a friend's house until 7. He had 50 minutes. He thought about the field note in case 7-114 administered per protocol in a paramedic's own handwriting against a typed record that said otherwise. He thought about his own medication order logged at 11:47, modified at 3:14 by an account with no clinical reason to be anywhere near that record. He thought about Vert.X ex-clinical partners, the name no one at Holt Air could trace back to a recognizable origin. The procurement channel that had bypassed the standard vendor approval process, the product that worked perfectly in a laboratory and degraded precisely in the conditions where Holt Air actually operated.
Charles.
He thought about Carlton O.C., 11 years as outside counsel for a pharmaceutical distribution group. That fact had surfaced in a discovery document during the divorce proceedings. He had read it and moved past it because it had seemed at the time like background noise about a man who was simply his wife's attorney. It was not background noise. He pulled into the parking lot of his apartment building, sat in the car a moment without cutting the engine. This was the same operation, not similar, the same mechanism, same logic, same purpose. 9 years ago, someone had used a documentation trail and an institutional process, an assigned agreement to remove Elijah Cross from a position where his work was a problem. And now someone was using a supply chain and a failed demonstration and a press contact to finish what had been started to ensure that if Elijah Cross ever surfaced again, anywhere doing anything in any room where his credibility might matter, there would be a second failure attached to his name on the federal stage. It too strikes the kind of record that closes doors for good. He turned off the engine, went inside, made dinner, picked up Zara at 7, and listened to her describe in considerable detail the plot of a movie she had watched at her friend's house and her very specific opinions about its third act. He agreed with her assessment. He made the right sounds at the right moments. He helped her get ready for bed and sat on the edge of her mattress while she arranged her stuffed animals in the precise order she required before sleep was acceptable. "You seem quiet," she said. "I'm listening to you," he said. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The face where you're thinking about something else but you don't want me to know." "You're thinking about something else." He looked at her. 11 years old, sharp as anything. "I have a work problem," he said. "Is it fixable?" "Yes," he said. "Are you going to fix it?" "Yes," he said. She studied him arrange the last stuffed animal lay back against her pillow. "Okay," she said, the tone of someone granting provisional approval pending further evidence. He turned off the light, pulled the door most of the way closed, stood in the hallway. He had said yes. Both times he had meant it, both times. Now he had to mean it all the way through. After Zara was asleep, he went to the kitchen. He pulled a sheet of plain white paper from the printer on the counter. And not the legal pad he used at work, a blank white page. He sat at the table, the same table where he had helped Zara with state capitals 3 weeks ago, where he had eaten alone for months, learning to inhabit a life that had contracted all at once. And he wrote in 2 columns the way he used to organize differential diagnosis when a patient presented with symptoms that didn't resolve into a clean pattern. Left column: What he knew, the Harrove medication log had been modified at 3:14 in the morning by an administrative account with no clinical access. 9 years ago, that modification had changed his documented order status from administered to not indicated, which had become the foundation of the incident report, which had become the foundation of the separation agreement, which had become 9 years of silence.
Da'asishim.
The hemostatic supply in Holaire's current flight kits had been sourced through a procurement channel that bypassed standard vendor approval. The vendor was Vert.X Clinical Partners. Nobody at Holdair recognized the origin of that name. The press story had published 6 hours after the demonstration ended, with internal operational data, which required a source inside the building with advanced knowledge of the failure. Carlton Osei had been outside counsel for a pharmaceutical distribution group for 11 years. That fact was in a discovery document from his own divorce proceedings. Carlton Osei had been on the courthouse steps when Viven's helicopter arrived. His face had gone neutral, not surprised, not managing new information, managing information he already had. Right column, what he didn't have yet. The name attached to the administrative account that modified Walter Grimes's record at 3:14 a.m. A provable legal connection between Carlton Osei and Vertex Clinical Partners, the identity of the press source. He stared at both columns for a long time. Then he opened his phone. He scrolled to a number he had not called in 9 years, had kept in his contacts without fully understanding why. Had looked at occasionally in the early years, and then stopped looking at because looking at it made the question feel closer than he could manage at the time. The name was Claudette Ferris. She had been the charge nurse on the surgical floor at Harrove Hospital the night Walter Grimes died. She had worked alongside Elijah for 3 years before that night, long enough that he knew she took her coffee black with 1 sugar and kept a photograph of her niece taped to the inside of her locker, and did her job with a steady, unshowy precision that he had always trusted, the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. 2 weeks after he signed the separation agreement and left Harrove, a text had arrived from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "I know you didn't do what they said. I'm sorry, I can't say more right now." He had saved the number. He had figured out whose it was. He had never called back because calling back meant opening something he wasn't sure he had the ground beneath him to open. He looked at the name on his screen now. Then he pressed call. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "I wondered," she said. Her voice was older. Not fragile, just older in the way voices get when years have moved through them and left something settled behind. "I always wondered if you'd call." "I need to ask you something," Elijah said. "And I need you to tell me the truth, whatever it costs. Because what I'm about to tell you means this is already past the point where either of us staying quiet does anything useful." He told her everything. The restored Harrove logs, the 314 modification, the administrative account, halt air case, 7-14, and the handwritten field note against the typed record. Vertex Clinical Partners, the demonstration, the press story with internal data published 6 hours after the failure. He laid it out the way he laid out findings in sequence without dramatizing it, because the facts assembled in order were dramatic enough on their own. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment, just the sound of 2 people on either end of 9 years of silence. Then Claudette Ferris said 4 words. "I kept a copy." Elijah went still. Of what he said, not a question. A breath held in place the access log from that night. She said the floor system ran automated backup logs every 4 hours. It was an old protocol. Most of the staff didn't even know it was still running by then. I pulled the 4 a.m. printout before anyone came around to ask what had been printed. A pause long enough that he could hear her deciding something. "I've had it in a safety deposit box since that March. I didn't know what to do with it. I had a daughter in middle school, a mortgage, no lawyer, no one I could trust to know what the right move was." Another pause. "I told myself I'd find the right moment." "The right moment," Elijah said quietly, "is right now." "A beat. I know it is," she said. "I've known for a while now." He was already reaching for his jacket before she finished speaking. He was at Viven's office at 7 o'clock the next morning, not 7:30, not 7:15. He had been awake since 4. Not restless, not anxious, just awake in the way you are awake when something has shifted, and sleep no longer has a claim on you because the thing that needed doing had declared itself and was waiting. He had the scanned documents on his phone. Claudette had driven to the bank the previous evening, pulled the safety deposit box she had been maintaining for 9 years, and photographed every page of the access log under the fluorescent light of a bank back room. She had not waited until morning. She had not asked whether it could keep. She had simply gone and done it because that was the kind of woman she was. Someone who had held something carefully for a long time, and when the moment came to release it, did not hesitate. He respected that more than he could find words for. Vivian was already in her office when he arrived. Coffee on her desk, a legal pad with notes on it in her compressed handwriting. The alertness behind her eyes of someone who had not slept well because she had been running calculations instead. He set his phone on a desk. The scanned access log was open on the screen. She read it. She did not read it quickly. She read it the way she read everything, completely without the performance of urgency. 4 minutes, maybe 5. She turned the phone slightly once to see a section more clearly. Then she set it down. "This is the modification," she said. 3:14 in the morning, he said. "Administrative Account Operations Management Division, no clinical access, no documented reason to be in that record at any hour, let alone that one. And this is 9 years old. 9 years old. Preserved on a floor backup log that an automated system generated at 4 a.m. before anyone thought about what had been printed." Vivian looked at the document again, not because she had missed something, because she was making a decision and was verifying, as she always did, that the decision she was about to make was the one she actually meant. "Pull it all," she said. Moment he said nothing. He had already said pull it. Once was enough between people who communicated clearly. 48 hours, she said. "I know," he said. He went back to work. The whole Air legal team was 4 people and 1 outside firm that Vivian retained for situations requiring more reach than 4 people could provide. 72 hours. That was how long it took them to build the picture. They started with Vertex Clinical Partners. The name on the purchase order, the vendor, nobody at Holt Air could trace to a recognizable origin. They pulled the Delaware registration and incorporation date 4 years ago. Registered agent listed as a law firm with offices in Atlanta and Birmingham. Small, discreet, the kind of practice that did corporate formation work for clients who preferred that the work not call attention to itself. They pulled the law firm's client relationships through disclosure filings and retainer agreements logged in the public record. The law firm had among its clients a pharmaceutical distribution group operating across the southeastern United States. Mid-size regional, not a household name, but not invisible either. The kind of company that moved product between manufacturers and hospital systems and did very well in the space between. That pharmaceutical distribution group had retained Carlton O.C. as outside counsel. For 11 years, Elijah read that sentence 3 times when they put it in front of him. Carlton O.C., the man in the charcoal suit on the courthouse steps. The man whose expression had gone carefully neutral when Vivian's helicopter touched down on the courthouse lawn. The man who had structured Renee's divorce settlement with a precision that Elijah now understood had been operating from a more complete map of the territory than his client had ever seen. Miss outside counsel 11 years for a pharmaceutical distribution company that had, through a registered agent, through a small discreet law firm, through a Delaware entity incorporated 4 years ago, supplied Holt Air Medical with a hemostatic agent that performed exactly as Elijah had described. It would perform degrading under vibration and heat in a helicopter on the day of a federal demonstration. 6 hours before a story ran naming Elijah Cross as a discredited consultant responsible for a failed protocol. He sat with that, and then Vivian's people went deeper. 9 years ago, in the months leading up to the night of March 14th, Carlton Usi had been lead counsel for a pharmaceutical group preparing to launch a new anticoagulant therapy into the surgical market. High cost, high margin. The kind of drug that generates significant and sustained revenue if it becomes the standard of care across a region's surgical centers. The kind of launch that requires a clear runway, no competing approaches, no protocol changes at the hospital level that would redirect clinical decision-making away from the new product. Elijah had been in those same months developing and presenting a protocol within Harrow's surgical department. A systematic approach to managing complex hemorrhage cases, evidence-based, designed to reduce unnecessary pharmacological intervention and concentrate treatment where it was most needed. The kind of protocol that, if adopted as a regional standard across surgical centers in Georgia and Alabama, would have significantly reduced the patient population for whom the new anticoagulant therapy would be prescribed. Not because the drug was bad, medicine because Elijah's protocol was better medicine for a specific category of patient, And better medicine in that specific category meant fewer prescriptions. Fewer prescriptions meant a smaller market. A smaller market meant a worse launch. A worse launch meant a worse return on 9 years of development and regulatory approval and the significant capital that had backed it. Carlton Ozy had not been hired to destroy Elijah Cross. He had been hired to protect a product launch. Elijah Cross been, from the perspective of that calculation, a line item, a source of risk, a protocol being presented in department meetings at a major hospital that, if it took hold, would cost someone a great deal of money. Down the mechanism for neutralizing that risk was already right there built into the institutional structure of Harrow Hospital. A death on the operating table, a record that could be modified from an administrative account in the middle of the night, an incident report drafted to produce a specific outcome rather than document what had actually occurred, a separation agreement with a confidentiality clause, and Elijah Cross 48 hours after Walter Grimes was pronounced dead, signing his own silence because he had a 2-year-old daughter and no proof and nowhere else being to turn. The mechanism was clean, quiet, entirely deanable, and it had worked for 9 years. It had worked. Then Vivian Holt had landed a helicopter on a courthouse lawn, and it had started to come apart. At Halt Air, Carlton had run the same architecture. Supply chain insertion through a shell entity, a compromised product that would fail under specific conditions, a press contact preloaded with the story waiting for the trigger. The goal was not to damage Halt Air as a company. The company was not the point. The point was to attach a second documented failure to Elijah Cross's name on a federal stage. 2 strikes, a permanent record. A man who had now failed twice. Once at a hospital, once in front of federal observers whose judgment had been questioned and found wanting not once but twice, who could never again stand in a room and say a protocol was wrong and expect anyone to listen. That was the goal, and it had almost worked. Almost, except Elijah Cross was no longer the man who signed documents in offices where he had no proof. He was the man who had spent 9 years building something back quietly without audience, without vindication, without anyone watching. And he had learned something in those years that Carlton OC running projections on a product launch from a law office in Atlanta had apparently failed to account for. The work was real. The work had always been real. And the people who had been in the rooms where the real work happened remembered what they had seen. Vivian presented the full evidence package to the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Monday morning. She went herself, did not send the legal team alone. She walked into the federal building in downtown Atlanta with the documentation in a folder and her attorneys at her side, in the composure of a woman who had built something real, and watched someone try to take it apart from the inside and was now placing the evidence of that attempt on a federal desk. The board met 48 hours later. Warren Briggs resigned before the meeting convened, not after. Before his resignation letter had been delivered to Vivian's office at 7 a.m. 2 paragraphs, no explanation. The letter of a man who could read where something was going and had decided not to be present when it arrived. Elijah was not in the board meeting. He was in the operations center reviewing updated training documentation when his phone buzzed. Vivian, he answered. She told him board had voted unanimously full restoration of his advisory access.
Ban Shishumem.
A formal request to the Federal Demonstration Oversight Body to reschedule. Pending protocol review and a motion passed without dissent to issue a press statement correcting the record on the demonstration failure. She said it in the direct way she said most things, efficiently without sentiment. But at the end, before she hung up, she paused for 1 second. The work was right. She said yes. He said it was always right. He said nothing to that because she wasn't asking him to confirm it. She was saying it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and has finally been allowed to take up the space it deserved. He sat with the phone in his hand after she hung up, looked at the wall across from his desk. On it, someone on the team had taped a photograph from the simulation drill. The pediatric scenario, the medic inside the helicopter door, hands moving in the clean economy of someone who had practiced the sequence until it was no longer a sequence, but simply what the hands did. Below the photograph in marker, someone had written the time 7 minutes 44 seconds. He thought about Walter Grimes, 47 years old construction foreman, a man who had come into Harrow on a stretcher on a March night and whom Elijah had tried with everything he had to keep alive. A man whose death had been real regardless of what happened to the record attached to it, regardless of who had sat at a computer at 3:14 in the morning and decided to rewrite the story of that night Walter Grimes had died. That was true, and it had always been true. And no amount of evidence recovery or federal investigation changed it. What the evidence changed was the story about why. And the story mattered, not for Elijah's sake alone, for every patient who had come after. For the 11 people lost in halt air transports over 2 years running protocols that had never been designed for the air. For the cases that would have gone differently if the protocol Elijah had been developing at Harrow 9 years ago had been allowed to take root instead of being buried along with his career. He was not returning to the work as a vindicated man collecting what was owed to him. He was returning because the work was not finished, and he was the person who understood it best. That was reason enough. For the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. The call from Garrett came at the end of that same day. Not a formal meeting, not a scheduled conversation. Garrett knocked on the open door of Elijah's office at 6:15 in the evening, when the building had mostly cleared out, and stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall. He held one out without preamble. Elijah took it. Garrett sat in the chair across the desk. He did not arrange himself. He sat the way people sit who have learned that comfort is adjustable rather than fixed. He said the simulation numbers were real. Elijah said yes. Garrett looked at his cup for a moment. I've been running operations here for 6 years. We've lost 11 people, and I've been telling myself it was the environment, the distances, the nature of the cases we take the inherent difficulty of the work. He stopped. I wasn't wrong about any of that, but I was using all of it to avoid the question I should have been asking from the start. Elijah didn't say anything. Garrett wasn't asking him a question. Garrett was telling him something. There was a difference, and Garrett knew the difference. I don't know what happened at Harrow. Garrett said, you do now. Elijah said, most of it. Garrett looked at him. The board meeting, Briggs, all of it. All of it. A pause. Garrett drank his coffee. What I said to you on the first morning, I remember it. I stand behind the reasoning, Garrett said. I don't stand behind the conclusion. That's fair, Elijah said. Because it was. Garrett had looked at the available information and drawn a logical conclusion. The available information had been incomplete. That was not a character failure. That was the problem with making judgments in the absence of the full record, which was, Elijah thought, the entire problem. The entire 9-year problem distilled to one sentence. The rescheduled demonstration is 6 weeks out, Garrett said. The protocol will be ready, Elijah said. Garrett nodded once. He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and looked back. 7:44 V, he said. 7:44, Elijah agreed. Previous best under the old protocol was 16 minutes and change. Garrett looked at him steadily. I looked it up after the first simulation. 16 minutes and change for years. We thought that was just how long it took. He shook his head slightly. It wasn't. We just didn't know to question it. He walked out. Elijah looked at the photograph on the wall. 7 minutes 44 seconds. He picked up his pen and went back to work. Claudette Ferris was contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office the following week. She would be called as a witness. She texted Elijah about it in the brief, direct way she communicated most things. 2 sentences confirmed. Ready. He called her back that evening. She answered on the second ring. You did the right thing. He said, I did it 9 years late. She said, you did it when you could. That counts. A pause on her end. Not agreement. Exactly. The pause of someone who had spent 9 years asking themselves whether it counted and had not yet fully settled on an answer. How's Zara? She said. She's good. He said she wants to be an architect now. Last Tuesday. Before that, it was a marine biologist. I'm keeping a list. Claudette made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, small and warm, the laugh of someone who has been holding something heavy and has put part of it down. You take care of that girl, she said. Every day, he said. Harrow Hospital issued its formal statement 6 weeks after the indictment, 2 paragraphs. The hospital acknowledged that the incident report filed following the death of Walter Grimes had contained inaccuracies that did not reflect the documented clinical record. It acknowledged that modifications made to the original medication order log had not been the work of the attending surgical physician. It stated clearly that Dr. Elijah Cross bore no clinical responsibility for the death of Walter Grimes. 2 paragraphs, 9 years. Elijah read it on a Wednesday evening in his kitchen after Zara had gone to bed. He read it sitting at the table under the overhead light with the apartment quiet around him. He read both paragraphs twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. He thought about Walter Grimes the way he always thought about him, with the sorrow of someone who could not change what had happened, and the clarity of someone who now knew it was not what the record had said it was. Both things at once, not resolved into something clean, just held together. The way you hold things too large to put down and too real to pretend away. Walter Grimes had died on that table. That was true, had always been true, would remain true regardless of what any statement said. What the statement corrected was the story told about why.
Bashushushusham.
And the why had mattered to Elijah's career and his marriage, and his 9 years of carrying a question without an answer had mattered to the 11 patients who had been transported in aircraft running protocols that should have been updated years ago, but hadn't been because the person who understood the problem had been removed from any room where he could raise it. The statement did not give those things back, but it gave the truth a place to live outside of him. A record words in the flat, institutional language that organizations use when they are required to admit something, which meant those words had been extracted rather than offered, and that made them in their way more valuable than any apology. He sat there for a while, then he stood up, washed his coffee cup, and went to bed. Carlton O.C. was indicted on a Thursday morning, 11 weeks after the board meeting at Voltaire. Wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify medical records. 3 counts federal charges, the kind of charges that come with a press release, and a set of bullet points that reduce years of calculated damage to lines of legal language. Elijah read the press release once on his phone in the operations center between a training review and a meeting with the rescheduled demonstration planning team. He read it the way you read something you have been waiting for long enough that by the time it arrives it feels less like relief and more like the closing of an account that had been running too long. He did not feel triumphant. He had expected to feel something larger and louder than what he actually felt. The undoing of 9 years of wrongful silence ought to move through you like weather with weight, with the physical sensation of something that has been pressing in, finally releasing. What he felt instead was quiet. Good quiet. The quiet of a room after something loud has been going on for a very long time and has finally stopped. Not emptiness, resolution. The kind of stillness that has something solid at its center. He went back to the training review. Renee came on a Saturday morning, 10 days before the Crosshold Center for Aerial Emergency Medicine was scheduled to open. She did not call ahead. She did not text. She simpered at the door of his apartment at 9:15 in the morning, wearing a gray coat with her hands folded in front of her, and the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say, and then at the last moment decided not to use the rehearsal. Zara was at a friend's house. The apartment was quiet. Elijah opened the door, looked at her. A moment passed between them where neither of them said anything. "Come in," he said. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the 2-column list had been written on a plain white page, where Zara did her homework and had strong opinions about state capitals, where Elijah had eaten alone for months, learning the specific skills of a life that had contracted. How to cook for one without the portion size feeling like a statement. How to inhabit evening hours that used to be shared. How to be still without needing the stillness to be filled. Renee looked around the apartment with the careful expression of someone taking in information. They have decided not to react too visibly. I saw the news. Yes, she said about Carlton. The story had broken 4 days earlier. Federal investigators. Carlton O's name in print attached to words like fraud and conspiracy and falsification. His firm had released a statement he had not figured you had. Elijah said he sat down across from her and waited because Renee had come here with something to say, and she was going to say it in her own time, and that was all right. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the refrigerator's hum became something both of them could hear. I knew he wasn't entirely honest, she said. Finally, Elijah said nothing during the divorce. Some of the things he told me about how to structure the settlement. She stopped. I knew they were aggressive. I asked about some of it, not enough. I didn't push because I wanted it to be over. A pause. She looked at her hands. I wanted to be done with everything. The years after Harrow, the clinic, the way things had been between us, all of it. I told myself I was protecting myself. You were, Elijah said. She looked up. That's not the same thing as being right, he said. She held that. I know that. He looked at her without anger, not with the cold distance that had characterized most of their last 18 months together. With the clarity that comes when you have been through enough that the energy required to perform emotions you don't feel becomes too expensive to spend for a long time. Ben, he said, I thought what happened to us was mostly about Harov, about what losing that high career did to me, and what watching that happen did to you. And some of that is true. What happened at Harov changed everything downstream. It changed who I was in the house. It changed what I was able to offer. I know that Rennie was watching him, but you didn't leave because I was broken. He said you left because leaving was easier than staying, and Carlton made leaving very easy. He gave you a structure that made it feel clean, and you let him because the alternative was harder, and you were tired. She didn't argue. She absorbed it in the way that told him she had been sitting with this version of the truth for a while before she came. Not defending herself, not looking for a different framing, just receiving it. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, she said. I don't think I've earned that. No, he said. You haven't. The words landed plainly, not as weapons, as facts. The kind of facts that require something to say and something to hear and are necessary regardless. Renee absorbed it without looking away. I want to be part of Zara's life, she said. Her actual life, not visits on a schedule, not calls that feel like checking a box. I want to be her mother in the way I should have been from the beginning. Elijah leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, weighing. The way you weigh something when the decision matters and you want to make it correctly rather than quickly. He thought about Zara, 11 years old, keeping a ledger somewhere, watching adults with that quiet measuring gaze that told you she was tracking things they didn't know she was tracking. Asking questions in careful voices, leaning against his arm on a Tuesday evening, and asking if they were going to be okay. He thought about what it would cost his daughter to grow up with a mother who was present in name only, arriving on scheduled days and departing again without leaving anything real behind. He thought about what it would cost her to grow up without a mother who was genuinely trying. Those were not the same cost. And Zara was the one who would pay whichever one it was. Then start with the truth, he said. Not with me, with her. She is going to ask you questions. She already asked me questions I don't always know how to answer. And she deserves honest answers, not a version of events that has been shaped to protect you. The actual truth in whatever pieces she can hold at a time. He paused. If you can do that, then we build something that works for her. That is the only thing I am interested in. What works for Zara? Renee's eyes were wet. She did not look away. Okay, she said quietly. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, fully given or received. It was not the end of something or the beginning of something you could name with confidence. Yet it was smaller than all of those things and possibly more durable than most of them. A door left open by a fraction enough for a child to walk through without having to choose between the two people who loved her most. Elijah walked to the kitchen counter, poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he had made at 7. He set one in front of Renee. They sat across from each other and talked about Zara. Not about the settlement, not about Carlton, not about Harov or the clinic or the years that had gone the way they had gone. About Zara, her homework, the geography worksheets, and her deeply held opinions about the injustice of memorizing state capitals when the internet existed, the soccer team she had joined in September, and her specific intensity about defensive positioning, which Elijah said she had not inherited from him, and which Renee said was something that was almost a smile and might have been a real one. She absolutely had. It was not easy. It was not the conversation they would have had if things had gone differently. If Harov had never happened, if Carl Tony had been a different kind of man. If Renee had made different choices at the points where choices had existed. Yeah, but it was honest, and honest was where things that were real had to start. The Cross Center for Aerial Emergency Medicine opened on a Tuesday in late October. The ceremony was held on the tarmac outside the main training hangar. October in Atlanta behaving like October, for once clear and slightly cool in the way that feels like a courtesy after months of heat. The facility had been expanded over the past weeks. A second simulation hangar added new communications equipment, installed a dedicated training wing for the rural county paramedic teams, who would work alongside Halt Air on the expanded federal coverage that the rescheduled demonstration had secured cleanly and without incident. And 3 weeks earlier, Vivian spoke for 7 minutes. She spoke about the 11 patients who had not survived their transports. She named them not as statistics or data points or evidence in support of a larger argument. As people, she said, the Cross Center existed because of them and because of the obligation their deaths had created, the obligation to understand what had failed and to build something that would not fail them again. She said Elijah's name once briefly near the end. He had asked her to keep it brief. She had Garrett stood near the hangar entrance in his field jacket watching the ceremony with the attention of a man who has looked clearly at something he got wrong and is at peace with the looking. The night before in the operations center over bad coffee from the machine down the hall, he had said something to Elijah that was not an apology, but landed with more weight than most apologies do. Elijah had received it the way it was offered, directly without ceremony, and that had been the right way to receive it. After Vivian finished speaking, after the attendees moved toward the hangar for the facility tour, and the conversations that happened at the end of official things, Elijah walked to the edge of the tarmac. Zara was already there. She had come with him that morning in the car, asking questions the entire 40-minute drive about the helicopters, about the new protocol, about whether the expanded training wing had better snack options than the old break room, which she had visited once and found wanting. He had answered the questions in the order they arrived, which meant the snack question was addressed somewhere around the 20-minute mark, and she had accepted this with reasonable grace. She stood at the tarmac's edge now, in the jacket that was still slightly too large for her, and that she continued to prefer for reasons she had not explained and he had not pushed. Her hands were in the pockets. Her head was tilted back, watching one of the Halt Air helicopters rise from Pad 3 on a routine transport run. The sound of it built then began to recede. She had asked that morning in the car whether she could come to the ceremony. He had said yes before she finished asking. "Is that one running your protocol?" she said, watching the helicopter climb. "All of them are," he said. She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things that mattered. All 31, all 31, She was quiet for a moment. The helicopter was getting smaller, moving north over the Triine. "How many people will it save? I don't know yet," he said. "That's not really an answer," she said. "Not unkind, just precise." "It's the honest one," he said. "We'll track the outcomes over time. Compare the numbers to what they were before. But right now, today, I don't know the number." She looked at him sideways. "But you think it will save people?" "Yes," he said, more than before. More than before, he said. "That's what I can say right now." She seemed to find this acceptable, if not entirely satisfying, which was approximately the right response, and told him not for the first time that she was going to be fine. Better than fine. She was going to be someone who demanded honest answers and recognized them when she got them, and knew the difference between honest and comfortable. That was everything. That was the whole thing. She leaned against his arm. Not a hug, not a gesture that required anything in return. Just the small, unconscious lean of a child who has decided the person next to her is a safe place to be. He put his hand on her shoulder and felt the particular lightness of it, the weight underneath that lightness. He thought about the version of himself who had stood on courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket, trying to remember how to breathe like a man who still had somewhere to be. He thought about the drive in Garrett's borrowed car, Atlanta falling away below the helicopter banking south. He thought about a simulation bay and a stopwatch in 19 minutes becoming 11. He thought about Walter Grimes the way he always thought about Walter Grimes, with sorrow that does not resolve, and the clarity that does not erase the sorrow but sits alongside it, making it possible to carry without being crushed. He had not saved Walter Grimes. He had tried, and the body had reached the point where trying was not enough. That was true and would always be true. What was also true was that someone had rewritten the story of that failure, had taken a real loss in a real operating room and turned it into a mechanism for destroying the person who had stood at that table and done everything right. And that truth, that second truth, had been waiting 9 years in a safety deposit box in the careful hands of a charge nurse who hadn't known what else to do with it except keep it safe. He thought about Claudette Ferris driving to the bank on a Tuesday evening, pulling the box, photographing every page under fluorescent light. He thought about Vivian Hull walking across a courthouse lawn in a charcoal suit and stopping 2 feet in front of him and saying, "Doctor." I crossed like it was simply a fact, like it had always been a fact. Like 9 years of a record that said otherwise had not changed what was actually true. Zara pulled one hand out of her pocket and pointed at the open sky. "Is that another one?" He looked. A second helicopter was visible distant, moving north on a different vector, different flight, different crew, different patient, somewhere in a rural county 60 miles out, waiting for help that was on its way. "Yes," he said. "Where's it going, transport run? Somebody needed help out in the county." She watched it, getting smaller, getting quieter, and they're going to be okay. He looked at the sky above the tree line where the aircraft was becoming a shape, and then a sound, and then almost nothing. They have a better chance than they would have had last month. He said she thought about that, processed it, in the way she processed things that mattered completely without rushing toward a conclusion just because a conclusion was available. "That's the honest answer," she said. "That's the honest answer," he agreed. She leaned against him again, and he kept his hand on her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while. The helicopter moved north and grew smaller and crossed the tree line and disappeared. And out there in the air above the counties, where the roads were long and the hospitals were far, and the distance between a person and what came next was measured in minutes that either held or didn't. Out there, something had changed. Not everything, not the distance, not the accidents that happened on back roads and in fields and on construction sites. Not the grief that followed, not the families who would still sit in waiting rooms and hear news that changed their lives, but the 12 minutes in the air, the sequence of hands reaching for equipment, the protocol in the kit, the difference between 19 minutes and 11 between doing the right thing in the wrong order and doing the right thing in the order that the environment government actually demanded, that had changed. That was and real. That would be there tomorrow and the day after, and in the data they would track over the coming months, and in the outcomes that would be different from what they would have been. Elijah Cross looked at the clear October sky above Atlanta and held his daughter's shoulder and understood in the quiet way that real things are understood rather than announced. That this was what beginning again looked like, not fanfare. Not a ceremony, though there had been one. Not a statement from a hospital, though that had come too. A helicopter in the air, a protocol in the kit, a child leaning against your arm with her hands in her pockets. And the work that had always been real even when the record said otherwise. The work that had been waiting. The way Claudette Ferris had been waiting. The way the truth had been waiting. Patient preserved, certain that the moment would come. The work that was just